The paper is called The Brave New World of Carbon Trading after Aldous Huxley's book, The Brave New World. In that book, Aldous Huxley has a foreword in the later edition where he says, "The greatest triumphs of propaganda have been accomplished not by doing something, but by refraining from doing. Great is the truth, but greater still, from a practical point of view, is silence about truth. By simply not mentioning certain subjects, and such facts or arguments as the local political bosses regard as undesirable, totalitarian propagandists have influenced opinion much more effectively than they could have done by the most eloquent denunciations and most compelling of logical rebuttals." Basically, failing to engage in people's debates and arguments is much more effective than actually trying to argue against the points that people make. When trying to actually have an open debate and argument about something like carbon emissions trading, papers like mine have actually been neglected. People don't wish to engage with the arguments. They would much rather talk about how these things are poor quality, or they would like to deride the author. So when we look in terms of the paper that I want to present to you today, I want to run through, first of all, the background to pollution control as economists discuss it, how economics approaches pollution and how it characterizes pollution. Secondly, then, to move into how that theory transfers into practice and what that means. How, when economists are talking about pollution control, they neglect a range of issues. They neglect things like complexity, strong uncertainty. They fail to take into account the structure of the real economy. So we're talking here about markets, power, and vested interests. And then I want to look into more detail in terms of emissions trading schemes and how emissions trading schemes are argued to be redesignable. That is, that the problems with emissions trading schemes, economists will say, we recognize, and those are recognized so that over time we can improve the schemes. What I argue is that the problems are fundamental and they cannot be designed away. And I'll run through greenhouse gas accounting, permit allocation, and emissions offsets as examples of why the schemes cannot be redesigned. And then finally, what I want to do in the last section is actually look at issues around promoting behavioral change and the individual action. So in terms of what's going on here, in terms of the individual's role and their interaction with carbon emissions trading schemes, how this affects the psychology of individuals, how it has ethical implications, and how it has implications for crowding out intrinsic motivations of individuals. So first of all, the background. Kyoto Protocol has been put forward as the best way that we can approach, or first step to approaching, greenhouse gas emissions. Ratified in 2001, requires an average of 5% reductions in carbon CO2 equivalent emissions over 1990 levels by 2008 to 2012 for a limited range of industrialized countries. Australia is the highest per capita CO2 source. It overtook the United States last year. And under Kyoto was actually committed to increasing greenhouse gas emissions by 8% over 1990 levels. There's tremendous variability under Kyoto between the treatment of different countries. What the science is telling us, what scientists are saying, is that we need to cut emissions of greenhouse gases by 80% on 1990 levels by 2050 to stabilize atmospheric concentrations, to stand a chance of not going above the arbitrary 2 degrees C target which has now been adopted. So a massive divergence between the policy that is being put forward and what the science is telling us we need to do. Then we look at what's been going on under the Kyoto Protocol and how Kyoto has been operating. What I argue is that there's been a change away from being concerned about effective control of greenhouse gases and towards an efficiency argument. The argument is now about how we can do things efficiently and not have an impact on the economy. What this means is talking about the role of free markets, how free markets can be used to make gains from trade, how financial centres can be set up so that they gain, how we can extend markets by making carbon a commodity, how we should protect the polluters such as the coal and aluminium sectors. The emissions trading schemes then come into this regulatory debate, and they've come in originally from the United States. They were pushed by the United States in the 1990s, but in actual fact adopted in a major way by the European Union after a failure to get a carbon tax through. So carbon tax was the favoured approach of the European Commission, and it failed to be a success, so they went for an emissions trading scheme instead. And then, of course, in Australia, the debate has been ongoing about the CPRS, the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme. Now, economic theory addresses pollution in a very specific way. In economic theory, pollution is a minor aberration on an otherwise perfectly functioning market system. The assumption of basic theory is that a market system can exist which is competitive, has no transactions costs, has no market power, and where information is freely available. That's the basic model. Pollution enters that as a small aberration, usually looked at in terms of a single point source pollutant. This assumes pollution control costs and the benefits of control are known and can be monetized. They're known and can be monetized so that you can actually conduct cost-benefit analysis and that you can get to a level of optimal pollution control. Optimal pollution control means equating marginal costs and marginal benefits, and it makes a whole range of assumptions to get there. Not only does it assume things like commensurability of different types of values, that values can be made all values can be converted into monetary terms, but it also assumes things like continuous functions, smooth continuous functions. Now, if we then move to how we want to regulate pollution under the standard approaches, you can put in a tax or you can put in standards. Taxes, generally as discussed in economics, taxes are on all units of pollution. That means that a polluter pays a tax even on the units they don't reduce, they don't control. So taxes are not favoured because they actually imply a large burden on the polluter. Therefore, standards, when pushed, tend to be more favoured. Polluters go for standards because what they have to do with a standard is they can put in pollution control equipment to meet the standard, and the units they don't control, they don't pay for. Right? So it's preferable for them over a tax. Emissions trading schemes then come into this picture as a hybrid approach between standards and taxes. It's a hybrid approach because you set a standard, under the main approach, you set a standard, and then you say, okay, we're going to go for efficiency gains on that standard by allowing polluters to trade the permissions to pollute. And the main argument, in fact I would argue the sole argument for emissions trading schemes, is that they are the most efficient approach. It's being promoted, emissions trading schemes are being promoted as the most efficient means of controlling greenhouse gases. And that's very important. So when we move from theory to practice, what happens is we find that economists in this standard approach have oversimplified a highly complex world. What we see is things like the emphasis has largely been on carbon and talked about carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is commonly cited as being 50% or less of climate forcing. That means that there's a whole range of other gases that have to be taken into account if you're concerned about controlling greenhouse gases. What this means is that you get into a whole argument about how to make those gases equivalent in terms of CO2 in order for economists to be able to operate a single pollutant model so that they can match their theory and reality. There's problems with highly variable emissions from different sectors. Different economies are very diverse. So you've got heavily industrialized countries with large amount of emissions coming from, say, point source pollution and from transportation sectors compared to agricultural economies with land use change and the agricultural sector being the source of emissions. A large amount of divergence with, therefore, a large divergence in the impact of these schemes. Very, very different from an approach where you're looking at a single stationary source model. Then we get to the problems with control costs. When the economic approach is being put forward, it's all about the balancing up of costs and benefits. One of the assumptions has been that control costs are simple and easy to calculate. Benefits and damages are commonly seen as very difficult, but the control costs, they're straightforward. It's as if you wanted to clean your water at home and you can go down to the marketplace and buy a water filter. You can just go into the supermarket, see what the price is, and you know the cost. Unfortunately, greenhouse gases are not like that. We don't know what the control costs are in that same way. There's extreme uncertainty here. There is also a whole range of values that come into play which are identical to the values that you have in terms of the benefit side of the equation. For example, loss of life. Whatever scheme that you put in place is going to involve some loss of life. So, for example, different types of construction schemes for different types of power generation involve different losses of life, whether it's nuclear or coal or building dams. People die in construction projects. That means those lives have to be taken into account when you decide if you're going to go down the efficiency route and take into account all the different changes as an economist. Then there's a whole range of issues around secondary benefits. If you decide that you're going to put in forestry, extra forestry, that means you're going to change the ecosystems. That means you're going to have to take into account ecosystems values, which means things like, are we going to get gains in biodiversity? How do we take that into account? So not simple at all. Then we come to this big issue. If we start changing the prices of greenhouse gases, and we do it as economists tell us we should, mainstream economists tell us we should, we will change every single price in the economy. Everything has got embodied energy related to greenhouse gases in it. There's nothing in this room that doesn't. The whole building, what you're wearing, the clothes, the pens, the computers. Every price is going to change. That is radically different than the economist's assumption of a single price being changed in a perfectly functioning market system. Efficiency claims, then, cannot be substantiated. The claims being made for an efficient regulatory approach and emissions trading being that approach cannot be substantiated. Then we come to the issue of market power and vested interests. In the economic model, the standard model, firms are price takers with no power. In actual fact, what we observe in the real economy, in the real world, is that there is a lot of power invested in specific types of institutions. For example, the rise of limited liability corporations has been one which has resulted in a lot of power concentration. Multinationals moving outside of national government control and regulation. And we see this, and it's highly relevant to greenhouse gases in terms of the energy sectors and the mining sectors. What this means in terms of pricing and the way that the market system operates is that firms do not take prices in a competitive economy. It means that firms are engaged in markup pricing, that they are involved in price discrimination, that there are oligopolies where firms collude together to set prices and to control markets, that there are monopolies who are in control of large sectors of the market. There is monopsony, where the price that they're buying their inputs at is controlled by the firms, and so on. What this means is that when you come along with your idea that we're going to change a single price and it's going to be an efficient outcome, you can't say that because price signaling does not work as it's expected. Now, some economists have questioned the mainstream economic approach. I'll give you an example here, just one amongst some. Kenneth Galbraith looked at economics and the economy in a different way. In Galbraithian economics, what you see is a two-sector model where you've got a large conglomeration of powerful interests and you have a competitive fringe. So what he's saying is, yes, there is a competitive fringe which is closer to the mainstream economist model, where there's a small producers, small medium-sized producers who are competing and who are motivated by profits. But you've got these very powerful large companies and large corporations which are there and are actually interacting with governments. He calls these the technostructure, and the way it interacts with government means that the government and these powerful interests are actually cooperating. Now, what we see in terms of climate change is there's some indications that Galbraithian analysis is highly relevant. For example, in the late 1990s, directly the US businesses were responsible for $100 million American dollars in lobbying against the Kyoto Protocol. That's just the money that is taken into account, which is on the accounts as direct lobbying. We've seen things such as arguments about the control costs for greenhouse gases being extremely high. And those studies appearing in academic journal articles, given credibility as independent studies, but then when you look at them, they're actually funded by the US electric power generating industry. And then there's the whole area of climate skeptics and the extent to which climate skeptics have been funded by corporations. Examples of this kind of analysis in terms of the emissions trading scheme in Australia we can see that large polluters are to be compensated with free permits. The smaller competitive fringe is going to have to compete in open auction markets. There's lobbying by the transportation sector, so there's reduced petrol taxes to protect the road and transportation sector. There's free permits going to be given to the exposed aluminium smelters. And the electricity generating industry in line for millions of free permits. This figure of 3.9 billion has now increased to, I think it's now 7.2 billion after negotiating and lobbying over the last 3 or 4 months. Markets and interests and power also is highly relevant in another way, the finance and banking sectors. Emissions trading schemes play directly to finance and banking. What this means is, as the Australian government has stated, there's an opportunity for business. One of Australia's major opportunities lies in being well placed to provide the necessary financial services to support developing carbon markets in the Asia-Pacific region. Australia has significant competitive advantage as a potential hub for emissions trading and related financial services in our region. So this is a growth industry. It's something that is seen as being positive. So we're going to get more finance, we're going to get more banking, we're going to have a growth industry here that's going to employ more people. Professional financial intermediaries, advisors, investment banks have all been investing in this area, developing new advisory roles, looking for potential commission and brokerage fees. Now, in mainstream economics, this is a transaction cost, right? This is deadweight loss. This is not something that is a gain. This is actually a cost of pollution control. It's not something that promotes growth that we should all be happy and clapping about. It's actually a loss. Establishing major new financial markets then seems a higher priority for many than effective or efficient greenhouse gas control. Then we look at the design of carbon emissions trading schemes and how they've been developed. The argument, as I said, has been put forward by economists that emissions trading schemes have their problems, we've recognized them, and we can redesign to get rid of them. What this means is that you can assume away problems of complexity and that they can be designed away. Let's just consider some of the complexity of these schemes. The Australian White Paper extends to 820 pages in 2 volumes. The Senate proposed 210 amendments as of November last year. It doesn't sound like a very simple and transparent scheme to me. The EU had similar problems with their scheme. The complexity of the scheme was such that it was attributed with political failure. That is, that despite proposing 80 amendments in the European Parliament, the European parliamentarians had to admit they did not understand the scheme and they were not able to put forward the policies that they thought would make it a better or improved scheme. There's 3 interrelated design issues that I want to look at here. First of all is accounting for the sources of greenhouse gases. Secondly, allocation of allowances. And finally, the actions permitted for offsets, the offset markets. First of all, greenhouse gas accounting. If we were concerned about effectively regulating greenhouse gases, well, how would we go about that? What would we do? Well, an self-evident thing might be to identify the largest sources and control them as a first step. But what we're talking about here is efficiency, right? And efficiency under emissions trading schemes means making greenhouse gases themselves a valuable item of exchange. It's a very different thing. This is a quote from Hatfield Dodds, who was a senior economist at the CSIRO and then joined a couple of years ago Australia's Department of Climate Change. And if you look closely at the Senate debates last year, you'll see him in the background advising Senator Wong when she was asked some difficult questions. He stated, with very few exceptions, nobody is actually going to be measuring carbon emissions. It's not a matter of putting a gizmo in a smokestack and measuring carbon as it goes past. It's really about getting the accounting system in place. So what we're designing here is an accounting system. And what sort of accounting system are we designing? Designing an accounting system which has to be comprehensive in terms of its physical accounts to start addressing the economist's claims. What that means is taking account of every single greenhouse gas, no matter where it is in the system. You have carbon in your bodies. You should all get permits. This also implies a level of certainty about systems which we just don't have. It's just unavailable to us. It does not exist. This is a neglect of strong uncertainty and also of the appropriate institutions required to actually address that type of uncertainty. Instead of taking a serious account of the type of uncertainty we're facing here, what we see is a pretense that we can get perfect knowledge, that research will improve our understanding, and that all we have to do is increase the research budgets and keep researching, and eventually we're going to have idealized carbon accounting systems. The reality is something different. The reality in terms of greenhouse gas accounting is that there's political negotiation between parties. So what we've seen in actual fact is negotiations, say, I give some examples here, Russia and Japan and their arguments over forest credits under Kyoto. They managed to increase their allowances for sinks of forests, which would imply that they've suddenly got more forests. These are paper forests, they're not real. This is negotiation. It's not about accounting for reality. Russian and Ukrainian hot air is famous, or infamous, I should say, for actually being a failure of this type of system. So the Soviet Union collapses, the industrial sector disappears, and yet they're still taken account as if it were existing in terms of the negotiations. The EU has also run into problems here. EU negotiations have got themselves to the stage where they created a bubble over the EU for overall emissions, talk about emissions targets, and then you've got to allocate between the countries within. The European Commission, trying to make the allocations, has got itself into problems because it is currently being challenged in the courts with legal cases by, I think the last count was 7 Eastern European countries who say that their allocations are not fair. Then we come to permit allocation, how you allocate these permits and the implications of that. Permit allocation implies property rights. It implies that you're giving the rights to pollute to people or institutions. In this case, what we're seeing is a claim being made that these are temporary things, that these rights are only temporary and they can be taken away at any moment. So we shouldn't really be worried about that. Actually, the experience is somewhat different, as we've seen with water permits in Australia. Once you give permits out to people, you've given them a property right, they will defend it, they regard it as their own, and they will take legal action to make sure that they actually have to be paid if you're going to take those away. So you give these things away, and then you've got to pay to buy them back. And the initial allocation issue then is very important. How do you allocate these permits that you're going to give out? Well, in order to get people to buy into the system, the most common method of allocation is to give them away. You want to give them away to get the political buy-in by the big polluters. And then how do you know how many to give them? Well, under the European scheme, they ask the polluters, what is your emission level? Tell us and we'll give you a bunch of free permits. Obviously open to self-reported emission errors, over-optimism about growth if you're going to be polite, and if you're going to be impolite you could say vested interest manipulation. Problems that resulted in over-allocation in the European scheme and the collapse of the emissions trading scheme. As Michael Grubb and co-authors have stated, government-industry negotiations contingent upon industry forecasts exacerbate the natural tendency of industry and governments to be optimistic about growth prospects by rewarding those that exaggerate the most. Since industry has all the real data and governments are likely to be risk-averse, the negotiations are inherently one-sided. It is a poor approach to adopt in the face of genuine uncertainty and incomplete and asymmetric information. Even worse, the prospect of future allowance distribution being contingent upon recent emissions, called updating, gives a direct incentive to industries to inflate their actual emissions. So we're not even talking now about inflating just paper emissions. We're talking about actual emissions increasing so that you can increase your allocation when the emissions trading scheme comes in. What happened in the European Union's case in phase 1? The EU ETS saw a collapse of the price. The price went from 30 euros to 12 euros in 1 month and eventually reached it down to 10 cents. Speculators and polluters have a great opportunity to make money out of this. So, for example, the Czech electricity giant CEZ is cited as having made massive windfall profits. If you sell at $30 and you buy at 10 cents, you make yourself billions. And they managed to build themselves a new coal-fired power station with the profits. Emissions offsets. Well, this is a major area of concern. Emissions offsets originally brought in as an area, as a mechanism by which less developed countries would be helped to achieve sustainable development goals. The idea being that not all countries would manage to meet their targets, and therefore, as a marginal stopgap, they would be able to invest in less developed countries in things like, say, forestry to sequester extra carbon. The most common mechanism under Kyoto is the Clean Development Mechanism, with the permits called Certified Emissions Reductions credits. Actually, I think they should be called Certified Emissions Increase credits, because what can happen with this is if you're increasing sinks, for example, what you're saying is we're going to build another coal-fired power station here in Australia, and what we're going to do is in a less developed country we're going to have more trees planted, more forests, more coal-fired power stations, more trees, more coal-fired power stations, more trees. The scale of greenhouse gas cycling increases massively as a result. The assumption is that the world and its ecosystems are some mechanical clock, some mechanical device. We push a button here and the light goes on over here. It's not applicable to reality. The problems with offsets include things like assuming the physical equivalence of sources and sinks. What I mean here, for example, is coal in the ground is being assumed to be the same as forestry carbon sinks. What we've got is effectively coal in the ground, right, is stored away and is not going to be burnt. Whereas if you look at forests, what are forests? Forests are basically grow, they sequester carbon over time, they burn down, they get chopped down, they change over time. They're not equivalent. What you take is a very certain form of securing carbon and you replace it with a risky form. They're not equivalent, and yet you have to assume equivalence to have these offsets. Assuming economic equivalence also means assuming equivalence in terms of the way that we balance up harms and goods. So, for example, assuming economic equivalence in terms of sources and sinks means that you're going to actually take into account all the impacts related to that. As an economist, you're concerned about all the range of impacts. So if you set up your forestry in a less developed country, you should be concerned about all the environmental impacts and all the social impacts in terms of the welfare. But what happens with these schemes is they're only concerned about the carbon offsets or the carbon equivalent offsets. They're not concerned about the social and environmental impacts related to it. Then there's this issue of additionality. The whole point of offsets is that they should be in addition to what you would do as normal. This is very hard to actually take into account in a lot of cases. What would have happened under normal circumstances? But there's also a range of people making claims here that they are going to get carbon offsets for undertaking things they would have done anyway. Commercial forestry. Commercial forestry would have gone ahead anyway, so it shouldn't get these offsets. Conservation projects, which were going to be undertaken anyway, should not get these offsets. There's no additionality. So the carbon offset industry, if we look at it, the European community has said the strong demand for emissions credits has led major European banks and other financial institutions in both the private and public sectors to become active in providing finance for prospective emissions reduction projects. In addition, many international carbon funds have been set up. This is a growth industry. It's a massive growing area. The failure to meet Kyoto means that there is billions being poured into bank accounts awaiting carbon offsets. European governments plan to buy 550 million tonnes of carbon offsets. They've already put into banks 2.9 billion euros. EU businesses have put in another 1.4 billion. They're basically billions and billions of dollars waiting in bank accounts to buy offsets. A massive amount of money and power behind a scheme which is not even being evaluated. Carbon offsets also run into the problem that they were never meant to be the entire scheme. They were supposed to be supplementary to domestic action. They were supposed to be a small part if you manage to fail to meet your targets. Kyoto specifies that offsets should not avoid domestic action. The Marrakesh Accords state, use of the mechanism shall be supplemental to domestic action, and that domestic action shall thus constitute a significant element of the effort made by each party, included in Annex 1, to meet its quantified emissions limitation and reduction commitments. Of course, this leaves open, what do we mean by a significant element? Well, in phase 2 of the European scheme, there's been some discussion around that being 8%. That means 92% of your reductions should be done domestically. However, more recently, there's been discussions around it being 50%. The Australian scheme in the white paper is very unclear on this. It states the government is confident there will be domestic reductions, and these will be significant. Then they have allowed unlimited offsets. If you allow unlimited offsets, cited as having been put in place due to industrial lobbying, unlimited offsets means there will be no domestic reduction. Zero domestic reduction, because offsets are cheap and they're bought from the third world where people are poor. That's what makes them cheap. This has led to an issue about quality control. Are these offsets really worth the paper they're written on? What's going on here? Well, the Worldwide Fund for Nature introduced the idea of a gold standard because they were concerned about the quality of offsets and what was involved with them. The gold standard basically tries to take into account social and environmental impacts outside of the pure, straight greenhouse gas reductions. What happens here is that they end up costing considerably more, and there's a lot fewer of those schemes around. And in a competitive market with no differentiation between the different types of offsets you have, bad drives out good. The gold standard credits will be driven out by the cheap, lower quality ones because they're equivalent. They're treated as equivalent. There are billions and billions of dollars, as I stated, waiting for going into offset markets. And there's just too few of these schemes passing this test. The Australian government, in its white paper, has, for example, stated that it does not consider it necessary to accept only those CERs that meet additional criteria, such as the gold standard. Neither does it consider that it should assess the broader environmental and social impacts of CERs. Basically, what they're saying is CDM projects can be positively harmful, both socially and environmentally, and they don't care. Because the priority is apparently obtaining a plentiful supply of cheap permits. To close the last section of the paper, I look at the individual and how individuals interact with these sorts of schemes, voluntary offsets markets and emissions trading markets. What I'm concerned about here is the way in which these schemes affect human behaviour and how they promote certain types of behaviour. If you're concerned about greenhouse gases, you want to take direct action, there's a certain number of things you can do. You can control your own emissions in various ways. You could maybe create sinks like planting a tree. You can give up your car, ride a bicycle and so on. Or you can buy voluntary offsets. The motives then that underlie people's behaviour are important. Why do people engage in different types of actions? And why do they undertake actions which we would like to promote or not do so? This means that there may be motivations such as environmental and social concern you need to take into account. Some people may do these actions because they just want to feel good. And then there's the concerns about doing the right thing. This all raises concerns which relate to markets and how markets operate and their interaction with people's psychology, the ethics we hold, and also the intrinsic motivation of individuals. So I'll look at these three things in turn. The psychology of voluntary offsets. What we see is that the voluntary offset market is a form of price discrimination. What it's trying to do is to target a particular group in society. If you think about it in these terms, the deep green don't fly, skeptics don't buy, and the moderately concerned are therefore those who are being targeted. It's a marketing approach to address the moderately concerned individual. There's no necessarily link here at all to climate impact outcomes. What's going on here is that marketing is being undertaken to make people feel guilty and then to get them to assuage their guilt by buying these offsets. You get a warm glow out of it and you can promote your green image. I buy offsets when I fly. I'm a good person. There's a real problem here. How do we verify these offsets? How do we know what's going on with these offsets? How many people buy offsets when they go flying, tick the little box, pay their couple of dollars, and have an idea about what those offsets are doing? How many people know where that money is going? Where do you think it's going? Do you think it's going for carbon sequestration, planting trees in a sustainable way, or is it going into a bank account and earning interest for airlines? There's a real problem here because we're not dealing with a tangible good. When you go down to the supermarket and you buy a loaf of bread, you've got a loaf of bread in your hands. If you buy a carbon offset, you've got nothing in your hands. You can't verify what it is that you've bought. And then even if there was a real scheme out there and they show you and they say, look, we've planted this forest, it's a carbon offset, they can sell that 10 times, 100 times. Where's the verification process? The psychology of offsets also plays on the individual in another way. Because once people have engaged in an offsets market, what happens is that they purchase these offsets and then they defend them. People will defend offsets. I buy Qantas offsets. Qantas is an Australian national company. It has a good reputation. It has trust and faith in society. Why should you criticize my offset purchase? Cognitive dissonance, that's called. People ignore the facts, they don't want to engage with the arguments, and they defend schemes which they know are flawed. Overcompensation can also then result in people's behavior because they say, hey, look, I can buy offsets now, so I can fly twice as much as I did before. There's no real problem with greenhouse gases. Good intentions, therefore, may be led astray where powerful marketing based upon social psychology plays upon genuine concerns. I'm saying people do have genuine concerns here, but there's a game going on here of marketing these things to get people to buy them that is unrelated to the real issue. Then we get to the thing about ethics. Ethics coming in here. Are pollution offsets equivalent to medieval indulgences? Medieval indulgences were where you would undertake a harmful action and you would actually then buy these indulgences to compensate for it. So, I'm the lord of the manor, I go over to a neighbouring area, do a bit of rape and pillage, come back and say, oh, sorry, God, I'm going to pay for a choir to sing for me for 10 years, and then everything will be okay. Of course, the market got more efficient, and then you could pay straight to the Pope, direct line to God. Pollution offsets have been equated to this. You undertake the pollution, a harmful act, and then you buy your offsets, and you don't have to change your behaviour. Now, are they really the equivalent? The thing with greenhouse gases is, you could say, is it a morally wrongful act to emit greenhouse gases? The answer has to be no, because if we were in a world where the sinks and the sources were equated and they were being taken up, if we had a different type of economy, a different structure of the economy where we weren't fossil fuel dependent and we weren't emitting so many gases, you could emit a certain amount and it wouldn't have the impacts that we're so concerned about with climate change. So they're not morally wrong in and of themselves. The interesting thing here, though, is the way that economists engage in moral issues, which they claim they don't, but they do. In their implicit moral theory, good and bad are equated. You do a harmful act, you can correct it by doing a good act. That's what cost-benefit is all about. That's what carbon offsets are all about. We're going to do something wrong over here, we know that's bad, and now we're going to do something good over here to compensate it. That is a highly dubious moral philosophy. The other issue here is who should undertake actions to control greenhouse gases? Should the people in less developed countries be doing that so that people in the developed economies can continue running their economies as they already do? The poor sell cheaply. That's the reason, as I say, we have the offset market operating. It's because poor people will set up schemes at a very low cost because they have very little money anyway. There's no issue here of justice or fairness or equity. It's just not on the agenda. So what I say is good actions are not simply those which make the most profit or cost the least money. Finally, intrinsic motivation and crowding out. What we see in the offsets market is a concern here about crowding out intrinsic behavior. Intrinsic motivation is something which you can trace back a long way, but let's take Adam Smith, for example, because economists like to claim Adam Smith as the forefather of modern economics, even though it's Hume that should really be the one. In Smith's theory of moral sentiments, he discusses something called an impartial spectator as a new type of moral theory, a theory based around virtue. That is, how should you run your life? Self-control being a very important element of that. People he sees as being intrinsically motivated to undertake good actions, right? An intrinsic motivation which is affected by the types of institutions you have in society. If you have market institutions, you can crowd out desired behavior. An example, real-world example from Switzerland, people turn up late to pick up their children from childcare. Right? A nursery says, right, we want people to come on time. So, because people are coming late, we'll charge them. The later they come, the more they pay. The behavioural outcome, you wanted it to change behaviour so people came on time. The outcome was more people come late. And they come even later, because now they're paying. You changed it into a market transaction. You've set up a certain type of institution without even realising what you've done. Now, emissions trading schemes, are they like that? Are they more susceptible to crowding out than anything else? Well, taxes have also been cited as leading to crowding out. But because emissions trading schemes are such a heavy market institution, I think they are more susceptible. Basically, individuals, as I've argued, will cease voluntary actions. If the schemes are weak, giving weak incentives, overall reduction targets will be limited, which means that you can actually get an increase in net emissions from the scheme. So while it's not a problem that's unique to emissions trading schemes, I feel that markets create such strong incentives and they remove intrinsic motivations of trust, autonomy and social preferences. The appropriate institutional setting is not the market, but one of shared social responsibility. To conclude, mainstream economics, in my opinion, currently provides an inadequate account of several things. Institutions, theory of the firm, political economy, human behaviour, ethical pluralism, non-efficiency goals. Just a few. Efficiency claims cannot be substantiated. That's the claim of emissions trading schemes, that they're going to be more efficient. They cannot be substantiated and they appear unjustified. Now look, regulatory instruments are never neutral. No regulatory instrument is going to be neutral, whether it's standards or taxes or whatever. But that means that we have to be aware that they're coming from a political and ideological position. And they play to very specific groups in society. Different regulatory instruments play to different groups. This means that the grounds on which we see emissions trading schemes being advocated as a gain for public welfare, as an efficient mechanism that's going to make us all better off, diverges from the reality of who now advocates the scheme, due to the potential for individuals gaining, groups gaining, and organisations gaining. Public policy analysis, then, of the emissions trading scheme and appropriate responses to the very real and present danger of human-induced climate change require open debate and discussion of the many problems. A little postscript. This paper, you may have heard, was banned. The full version of this paper, after it had been peer-reviewed both internally to CSIRO and externally by international peer review for journal, the paper was banned. The CSIRO managers wrote to the editor of New Political Economy demanding the paper not be published. The CSIRO maintained the right to ban this paper, not only by me in my role as a CSIRO officer, but also as a private individual. Now, they've stated that, Senator Carr has stated that CSIRO was protecting its brand image. If that's the case, why not let me publish it with a disclaimer as a private citizen? The matter was under debate since June 2009. What happened eventually was that the issue got into the national media, and then it was picked up by the Greens in the Senate. Eventually, the paper was forced, after Senate vote, to actually be tabled in the Senate, but this did not happen until first CSIRO senior management had attempted to rewrite the paper, cutting 11% of the text, cutting the conclusions in half, rewriting the paper so that it was not an argument about emissions trading being something that could not be redesigned, but it was an argument about how emissions trading could be redesigned, and we were aware of the problems. When the paper was finally tabled in the Senate, there was also a 3-page attack on me making a series of false allegations. That was written by the CEO of the CSIRO. The latest thing is that they claim the paper is low quality, and that's the problem, and that was always the problem. I resigned my post in December, 2nd of December 2009 in order to make sure that I did not have to continue putting up with this kind of manipulation and playing around with scientific research, and to make sure that this paper got out in its full, unadulterated version.
What would be the economic effect of the government abandoning the ETS after several years of operation?
If it was operating for several years, I think that would be a miracle. I would imagine that it would collapse, but long before that. What would happen if they run the scheme as I can see it running right now with free offsets, is that you're going to get a massive offset market overseas and an import of permits. At the same time, you've got a massive wealth distribution, like you're giving money, like billions of dollars are being given to polluters. So your guess is as good as mine about what that would imply at the end of the day, and how, it wouldn't operate. I don't think it could operate for very long. It's setting yourself up for a disaster.
But if it's going to be such a big business and everyone is investing in it now, what do you think it will be that will cause it to fail should it go through?
I think part of it is that it's not going to control greenhouse gases, right? That's very clear. Another part of it is that you're allowing massive speculation. It's a financial instrument. So what you've created is a vested interest in having another financial instrument, as we've seen before, and so you've got a financial market set up. You've got on one side people are going to be losing any concern about actually controlling greenhouse gases. They assume that something's being done when it's not being done. And on the other side, you've created a whole bunch of vested interests in actually just making a market operate, which is worth billions and billions. At some point, the bubble bursts.
Clive, there was a number of things in your presentation which maybe you do explain further in the paper. But with the CDM market, and I've done a bit of research into it, but it's not hugely extensive. I don't know how it compares to yours, but my understanding that's fantastic. It enables the developing world to develop in a sustainable way. Like when you were arguing about the credits cheap because they will just produce things because it's cheap and we're taking advantage of them. I actually think it's, I don't feel that it is taking advantage. I think we've created a system which is enabling them to continue to develop, but making sure that they're doing that in a relatively clean fashion. The
problem is that if you're concerned about development, then you set up development projects. You don't set up projects which are about carbon trading and carbon emissions offsets, and then ignore social and environmental impacts of the projects. There's a list of projects which have been enumerated by environmental NGOs which have actually failed. And the reason that the Worldwide Fund for Nature set up their gold standard was explicitly because of this concern about the failure of these projects to take into account their impacts socially and environmentally, right? They were also meant to be it was meant to be a supplementary aspect of undertaking control. It was not supposed to be, and never supposed to be, the major form of controlling greenhouse gases.
In Europe, they've made that very clear that, and you did explain that would be 8%.
But that's still being debated. The discussion, as I said, was also going up to 50% now. In Norway, there's arguments, from the economists there, that they should just allow free offsets. It's a free market. Why not have maximum number of offsets? It's the cheapest way to control, and therefore that's what you should have.
But is that a massive flaw? I mean, with an emissions trading scheme as opposed to carbon tax, you're setting a cap on the pollution. Now, I know there are many assumptions, and I think you raised some very valid arguments, but if we can set that cap, then I don't see a problem in having 50% offset and then 50% domestic.
There's a lot of problems, I think, with it. I mean, you started out by arguing that this was a good way to create development, to actually go about doing development, right? So what's the real problem with development? Why do we not have development? What do we mean by development? Is it a lack of funding? Is it a lack of funding? Is it a lack of will to pour money into these countries? Is that the problem? Or is it the fact that we have war, that we have industrial military complex, that we have fights over resources? You know, I mean, if you're really concerned about development, then address development. Don't pretend that carbon emission offsets is some form of development and progress.
Just picking up on the theoretical, it's not considered a practical mess, but just in terms of claimed theoretical advantages of emissions trading, you've focused on the efficiency argument for it. But one of the other key arguments, of course, has been an effectiveness as well, in that by setting a cap on the emissions, which are actually driving climate change, it has an effectiveness advantage as well under uncertainty. Whereas if you set a price, you might get emissions reductions, or what level you're not sure. So really, I mean, the theoretical advantages are often actually largely put forward as one of some sort of certainty and effectiveness in terms of getting emissions down.
Yeah, it's interesting. So if you were going to set a standard, why not just set a standard? If you take out the efficiency argument, then just set a standard.
The standard would just say that, for example, each industry has to, have a certain level of, or have a standard, like a technology standard or an emission standard. But you could have as many industries as you want. So there's no cap on the emissions in reality. It's just each one. So there's new.
No, it depends. It depends how you set the standard. I mean, if you're going to set a cap, if you set a cap, right, on emissions, you can do it as a direct regulation. If you take out the efficiency argument here, yeah, if you take out the efficiency argument, there's no argument between an ETS and a standard. What is the argument?
Oh, I'm not saying that it's, I'm saying your claim, as I understand,
Why would it,
was that people put forward emissions trading in a theoretical basis purely on an efficiency.
Yeah.
Actually, no. They often put it forward on...
as being more effective than a direct regulation.
Well, the point being that direct regulation of a factory doesn't stop another factory, and direct regulation of a sector doesn't control another sector, whereas in theory, emissions trading caps the emissions going to atmosphere, which actually drive the warming.
You're all forgetting the argument. The argument is that efficiency drives innovation, and that will drive decreasing greater efficiency in technology. Setting the standard makes the assumption, which is a primary problem with mainstream economics, that innovations can be drawn off a shelf, as it were, that they're internal to the economy rather than external. So that's another additional argument. I mean, in general, I agree with you, but it is a gross simplistic focus narrowly on efficiency.
For me, the issue here is that the emissions trading schemes are primarily advocated as being efficient schemes, and that's the main reason that they're being pushed forward. Effectiveness, if we start having a debate about effectiveness, I don't see why you can't design direct regulation to achieve effectiveness. And I don't see that emissions trading schemes have any advantages, as they are a standard, a regulatory standard, a cap standard, which is then adding on trading. So it's a regulation with trading.
Maybe just 2 points. One to the text. I'm just involved in assessing the load-based license system, which is a kind of a local pollutant tax on NOx and SOx and stuff like this here in New South Wales. And when you look at the data, nobody can actually say what the effect is. You really need an econometrician to say if this tax has driven any reductions. And so the emissions trading scheme, at least, by having a low price, will tell you that, the cap was set wrong, and that's what we see in the EU. But they have seen, that the price collapsed, and they have basically made the targets more restrictive. And they are also moving into more auctioning in phase 3 to actually avoid some of these windfall profits. I wasn't here from the beginning of your presentation, so I'm not exactly sure what you were saying about that. But what we've seen, and I've done a study with some colleagues on, how the different how the scheme is evolving over time. I agree with you, it's not perfect. From the beginning, it had a lot of flaws, the EU ETS, but over time, they were able to actually improve it.
Yeah, this is exactly what I was saying in my talk. This is the standard economist argument, is that these schemes can be redesigned over time to make them match the model, right, and be the efficient scheme that is described in the textbook. My argument is that cannot be achieved because the economic model doesn't take into account fundamentals of the economy and aspects of the economy about markets and power and structure and a whole range of issues which I discuss in the paper. That it cannot be redesigned. You cannot design these things away. They're fundamental aspects of the political economy.
Okay. My
Right?
second point,
The point, to address your other aspect, is that in terms of a tax, you just rank, even in theory, you just increase the tax if you want to get the reductions.
but how do you see your reductions? You need to know what would have been the emissions otherwise, and you would need to do some kind of econometrics to find out, where the reductions actually by introducing this tax.
Yeah, but what we're talking about is like trying to be effective at reducing emissions, okay? To actually, I would argue, to hit big sources, to identify the big sources and to reduce those first. But we're talking about 80% reductions, I say again. This is not a little bit about reducing something marginally, doing some econometric studies to see if we've got a marginal change here. This is a major reduction.
In what time frame are you talking about 80%? It's over time.
2050 is the paper I was citing,
Yeah.
but who knows?
You were talking about, CDM, and at the same time you were, comparing forestry projects with a power station. In which country have you ever seen that? Because the EU is actually having a ban on TCRs and LCRs, which are the forestry projects. So
I use it as a simple example because people can understand it very. It's not necessarily wrong. There have been forest projects. There have been funded projects. I don't know, but the majority of projects, you're correct, are actually energy projects. So what we see is things like CFC production in India with biogases, which are actually greenhouse gases, being destroyed and then getting carbon credits for them. Yeah? So energy projects in China, building dams and going ahead and getting emissions reduction credits for them, right? That's what goes on. And would those dams have been built anyway? Yes, they would have. There's no additionality. They run into exactly the same problems.
Yeah, but I fully agree with the additionality. But it's not like TCRs and LCRs, which are the forestry credits, are, for example, also not being discussed to be eligible.
There is a major argument about these under the RED schemes. The Australian financial sector has set up forestry schemes in the expectation that they will be made legitimate. They've invested in them already. Don't pretend that these are not on the agenda. They are on the agenda. We're talking about billions of dollars of offsets. Where are they going to come from? Those schemes are going to have to come online in order to get this level of operation. The aim of the paper was to address problems with the emissions trading scheme. It's very common whenever an economist raises problems about economics, for people to come back with, what would you do, what's your alternative? There are alternatives. There are lots of them. And there are people who write reports all about what the alternative should be. I haven't done that in this paper, no. But I do believe that what we need is fundamental restructuring of the economy, and that we have to do it very directly, and that maybe carbon taxes would be part of a transition to enable us to finance it and to get a different type of economic structure. But if we're talking about 80% reductions in emissions, for example, does that mean shutting down the coal industry in Australia? 30% of emissions come from... I mean, what does it mean? It means changing the fundamental structure of the economy, the way that we operate.
Just because you mentioned you come now from Norway, Norway has a carbon tax for many, many years already, and now they've got, they are part of the EU ETS, they took over the directive. So when you compare these two instruments, so a country where both instruments are actually implemented, and the tax was there before, so my question is, why did they not keep that, or why did they, on top of the tax, actually implement an ETS? And do you think the tax has really achieved any emission reductions substantially and would be able to drive 80% reduction?
No, I've already said that you need more than a tax to get to 80% reductions. I think the reason that they went for ETS is because they're very...
They're both.
Yeah, I know, but you're asking me about why they went for ETS as well. So I think the reason that they went for the ETS as well is because they're very keen to buy offsets. They're also heavily pushing RED schemes, and they're investing in that, yeah, which is the forestry thing that you said wasn't going to happen.
And do you think their carbon tax is perfect, or would that be a... Would that be
I haven't studied the Norwegian carbon tax, so maybe I will.
Didn't do much with regard to emission reduction, but most of the big...
Well, fine. You're obviously more experienced in the Norwegian carbon tax than I am. I don't know the ins and outs of the detail of it.
I'd like to say thank you to Clive for coming.